The prevailing narrative of the 21st century suggests we live in a post-geographic world. We are told that a highly connected global economy, driven by transnational capital, has erased the old borders of colonialism. The logic is straightforward. If capital moves smoothly between global nodes, traditional concepts like margins and centers no longer apply. But literary and cultural critic Ania Loomba offers a distinct counterthesis. She argues that the events following September 11th, specifically the global war on terror, prove that globalization did not end imperialism. Instead, it facilitated what she terms the new American empire. Looking directly at Loomba's 2009 text, Globalization and the Future of Postcolonial Studies, we see her isolate this exact assumption. She notes that advocates of globalization claim the world can no longer be analyzed using margins and centers, invoking a complete break from the history of colonization. Loomba counters that the violence of the early 2000s cannot be separated from these economic shifts. The military interventions and the borderless market are two sides of the exact same phenomenon. This photograph of the September 11th attacks marks the moment the frictionless facade of global capitalism was stripped away, exposing the rigid power structures underneath. Loomba's argument reframes globalization not as the end of imperial dynamics, but as the environment in which this new American empire takes shape. If economic data reveals the structure of these networks, fiction can be used to examine how those structures actually impact individual lives. Mira Nair's cinematic adaptation of The Reluctant Fundamentalist provides a precise case study. We can track its protagonist, Changez, as a representative post-colonial subject navigating this system. This is Lahore. As a young man originating from here, Changez represents a formerly colonized subject who is recruited into the highest tiers of the elite global workforce. By tracking his professional and personal trajectory, we can observe how corporate globalization and state imperial power operate on a continuous loop. His career at the fictional valuation firm, Underwood Sampson, gives a literal face and body to the abstract theories of global economic extraction. The political theorists Michael Hardt and Antonio Negri define this modern iteration of dominance simply as empire. In their text, they state that this contemporary global order establishes no territorial center of power and does not rely on fixed boundaries or barriers. Instead of conquering and repelling outsiders, this system actively expands by incorporating minorities into its mainstream. It replaces direct territorial control with organizational management. As the text shows, it manages hybrid identities, flexible hierarchies, and plural exchanges through fluctuating networks of command. Changez's recruitment by Underwood Sampson is a direct application of this theory. He is never physically conquered, he is willingly absorbed for his intellectual utility. The firm heavily rewards his cultural fluency and work ethic. He is allowed to keep his distinct identity, provided he performs strictly within the parameters set by the network. This contrasts sharply with the medieval doctrine of translatio imperii, where imperial legitimacy was explicitly transferred by conquering territory and suppressing local cultures. Modern empire functions as an inclusive but highly conditional republic. Its subjects are rewarded for optimizing the system's output, never for their absolute loyalty. This optimization serves an ideology known as market fundamentalism. Economist Joseph Stiglitz identifies this as a flawed economic approach that forces developing nations to prioritize corporate profit over the welfare of their own citizens. Journalist P. Saynath takes this further, writing that this specific brand of fundamentalism destroys more human lives than any other, simply because it cuts across all national, cultural, geographic, religious, and other boundaries. Changez's explicit job at Underwood Sampson is to value companies strictly to maximize profit, completely ignoring the human cost of the resulting layoffs or closures. At a macro level, institutions like the World Bank enforce these exact valuation metrics on entire developing nations, dictating domestic policy with the absolute authority of a colonial ruler. The International Monetary Fund applies similar leverage, using international debt to mandate structural adjustments. Stiglitz's critiques clarify the mechanisms behind these institutions, showing how economic policy functions as a tool of control. Long before anyone in the West suspects Changez of religious extremism, he is systematically trained and highly paid to be an economic fundamentalist. This illusion of integration extends to his personal life through his relationship with Erica, an American woman who represents the promise of full acceptance into the empire. She mines the intimate details of Changez's life and culture for her own creative projects without his full consent. Their dynamic replicates the asymmetrical power of global trade. One side extracts value without offering equal standing in return. Pulling him in the opposite direction is his father, a poet from a declining social class in Lahore, who maintains a historically grounded skepticism toward American hegemony. His father explicitly warns him against becoming a modern-day janissary, a historically conscripted soldier forced to fight someone else's wars while operating under the delusion that he is a free man. Erica embodies the conditional incorporation offered by Hardt and Negri's network, while his father voices the exact post-colonial critique that the network will inevitably refuse to tolerate. The attacks of September 11th immediately shattered the illusion of a borderless world. In the aftermath, it became explicitly clear that hyper-nationalism and state security interests still override globalized corporate culture. The moment suspicion sets in, Changez is reclassified. His utility is forgotten, his cultural and religious background becomes his defining feature, and he goes from elite employee to suspected threat. This individual reclassification perfectly mirrors the geopolitical shift. The United States quickly abandoned the rhetoric of gentle incorporation for overt territorial imperialism, using military force to secure its interests. To justify this aggression, proponents of the new empire began actively revising history. Academics and policymakers started publishing texts suggesting that older colonial structures, like the British Empire, operated without racism. This historical whitewashing was deployed to frame contemporary military invasions not as conquest, but as a noble mission to establish a stabilizing global order. While it refuses to call itself an empire, the U.S. assumed the role of a sole superpower, claiming the unilateral right to police the globe. Changez's isolation reflects an institutional backlash. Groups like ACTA complained that university curricula were corrupted by social issues. Commentators urged tying academic funding to national security, targeting post-colonial theory's core premise, that scholars shouldn't put their knowledge strictly at the service of imperial power. This traces back to scholars like Edward Said, whose foundational text Orientalism rigorously proved how academic scholarship was historically weaponized to justify colonial state power. In the conclusion, Changez returns to Lahore as a university lecturer. He stops valuing corporations and starts teaching his students to actively question state power. To the eyes of the intelligence agencies monitoring him, this makes him a terrorist. A system built on total compliance cannot distinguish between a professor teaching critical thought and a militant organizing violence. As critics like Noam Chomsky continuously point out, structures of global dominance demand ideological conformity, criminalizing dissent to protect their market share. Globalization has not rendered post-colonial critique obsolete. By focusing on the links between cultural forms and geopolitics, it offers a powerful way to decode the relationship between modern institutions and their subjects.